Welcome, Chrysta, to Fully Booked. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Megan.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on to discuss normal family on truth, love, and how I met my 35 siblings. Okay, first things first, how did you learn you had 35 siblings you hadn't met yet?
Oh my gosh. That is a long story.
We've got
time. My mother discovered that my father was secretly a very prolific sperm donor at the California Cryobank when the story appeared on the front page of the New York Times.
Whew. And what year was that?
That was in 2005, I want to say.
And what did she do when she saw that story?
She had an escalating nervous breakdown that involved,
as one might.
To go back to the beginning, my mother was a lesbian in the 80s who really wanted to have kids, but she didn't know anyone in her community who had started a family. You know, the most they had were dogs or cats. There was still, this was 10 years before Ellen came out. It was a completely different time. But she really wanted kids. And so she, in many ways, was a trailblazer trying to figure out how to start a family and felt guilty at the idea of not giving us a father figure. So she went on a manhunt to find a dad for her kids. And my father walked into a hair salon in Beverly Hills, and my mom looked at him and said to herself, that's the one. That's going to be my kid's father. And she went up to him and asked him out to lunch, and she offered him some money over lunch to become, for some sperm to have a kid, to fulfill her lifelong dream of having a child. And then after that, feeling guilty about not giving us a father figure, she proceeded to pay him to be in our lives and play the role of father. And when she made that initial agreement with him, she made him swear he would never do it for anyone else. And of course, he agreed, because why? It's not like women were coming up to him on the street asking to donate his sperm all the time. But then,
right.
As she got into it further, into the process of conceiving me, she took him to the California Cryobank to test his fertility and make sure he had no STDs. And he saw some men lining up to give sperm and realized, oh, that's why she made me swear I would never do it again. And so I guess she inadvertently introduced him to the trade. And so for the next 10 years, he donated sperm a few times a week, or almost 10 years.
Wow. Okay. A little bit more to flesh it out. So your mother saw this man. He was gorgeous, right?
My father was gorgeous. Yeah. In 1985, he appeared as the centerfold in Playgirl, unbeknownst to her. So.
And after they met, so she saw him, beautiful man, they got to talking. And furthermore, it seemed that he had this really enticing pedigree.
He did, yeah. He told her that his great uncle had been Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. His father had gone to Yale. His mother had gone to Radcliffe. He had, grown up on the East Coast in this very well-to-do family. It was a very impressive background. And my mother thought, oh, this is the perfect man to father my children. And he wound up being a little bit less conventional than all of that.
Right. And it's interesting. And it's also a fun challenge as your interviewer to try to hold back the many surprises in this book. This is such a riveting read, and the structure of this book is really ingenious, because we don't start there per se. The book starts with a prologue, and it's a little more modern day. What's going on with that?
Yeah, in the prologue, I am, it's present day me a couple years ago, and I'm opening up my house to host, more than a dozen of these half brothers and sisters, most of whom I've never met. And, I'm the first kid, so they're all a few years to 5 to 10 years younger than me. And they're coming to my house, and it's a truly surreal experience to meet all these half siblings that you didn't know existed, and yet with whom you share so much in common, both physical traits. We all share the same large big toe. Many of us have a dimple on our right cheek. Many of our faces look startlingly similar. We all have, or many of us have ADHD. Many of us are interested in the arts. It was just a wild and surreal experience when I finally opened my heart to this larger biological family.
Right. And so in this scene that you've crafted, this is the first glimpse we get of your mother and also of your younger sister. Mm-hmm. How did she feel about this gathering?
My little sister, Caitlin, was not excited about this gathering. She didn't understand why I was hosting the siblings. She didn't understand why I was calling them siblings. She didn't think that sharing biology with someone means that they should be in your life or be part of your family. And later in the book, I explore, that her feelings around that were actually more complex than I just made it out to be. But I don't want to spoil that.
Sure. Yeah. Could we sketch it out a little? Well, let's turn to your feelings about this. I mean, in this book, you grapple with the meaning of family. People to whom you're related by DNA, people to whom you are related by experience. I mean, and it seems that you had your own evolving appreciation of what family could mean. Where have you landed? Is it hierarchical? Biological family, chosen family, or do you take a more pluralistic view now?
Yeah, I mean, that I did bring up these bigger questions that I hope readers will ponder themselves. What is family in our modern day age? Does sharing biology with people make them our family? We're no longer beholden to family structures of past generations. But with 23andMe and Ancestry.com and DNA testing, all kinds of complexities within families are coming to the surface that were buried in different kinds of family secrets. And I just think that leaves open a lot of interesting questions. Now I find out about a new biological half brother or sister every few months.
And, oh my gosh.
But my own approach to the siblings has changed. When I first found out about the siblings, when my mother told me, which is, that's another story entirely, why she wound up telling me about the siblings. But she was very much, as I said, she had this nervous breakdown at the idea of it. I think because she had worked so hard to give my sister and I this sense of belonging to a family, even though it was an incredibly unconventional family. And so to wrap her head around, growing up, we'd had a lot of different mother figures because she had trouble with monogamy, and we'd had, just so many changes in so many ways. And so I think this was just an extra thing that she just did not want to lay on top of my sister and I. And she brought so much. She was so overwhelmed at the idea of it that I think I really took on her attitude. And so for the first 10 years of learning about these siblings, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. And I just sort of buried this as something that had happened, but that I wasn't looking at for a long, long time. And then it was this truly wild and magnificent chance experience with one of the half siblings that totally changed my attitude towards the whole thing, all the way to the point of embracing them and inviting them over.
So how did you go from that serendipitous encounter to the sibling reunion to writing the story?
I mean, so the writing of the story, I wanted to write the story of me and my mother for a really long time. And, since I was 17, I think was the first time I tried to start writing that story. And the book is about this larger family, and it's about family in general and what is family, but it really is a bit of a sort of a love story between me and my mother. And, because she's just this, she's this larger than life human being who was incredibly complex. She was the leader of in leadership positions in cults and pyramid schemes. And she was, a struggling alcoholic drug addict, but she was also, she lived boldly and was incredibly ahead of her time in so many ways. And so, I wanted to write about her and grappling with all my feelings about her. And then, but for some reason, I just struggled through the writing. And I think part of it was because when I, through the years when I would try and write parts of that story, I still was healing from the harder parts of my upbringing. And I still had a lot of resentment I had to work through. And I think that some part of me knew that the story was also still evolving, and that it turned out that it was a much bigger story than just my tiny little family. And so I'm glad that it took as long as it did. But the seed of the story started long before finding out about my father's sperm donations.
I pulled this wonderful line. You write that an old friend of your mother's once said, "Your mother is one of the great characters of the Western world." And as your reader, having gone through the experience of reading this book, I tend to agree. She's utterly compelling. I don't know that I would have been able to resist her myself had our ages aligned. But you've made such a compelling character of her in this book. And I just wondered a little bit more about, how you do navigate, the channel between the rocks, of like acceptance, resentment, like you're laying out a lot of difficult events in a life in this book. And I'm wondering how you think about striking the right balance of, telling the extent to which it was, bad or harmful, but also, demonstrating your gratitude or appreciation for it, for this kind of childhood.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it was a very up and down childhood. We were wealthy. We were on the verge of homelessness. We had so many different parent figures coming in and out. We moved so many different times. But also it was filled with a lot of love and joy and humor. And I'm so grateful that I don't have that instability in my life anymore, but I'm also grateful for the fun journey. I wouldn't go back and relive my childhood, but I'm grateful for the childhood I had. And my mother is in my life now, and we have such a close relationship. I think a big piece of that was getting to know her as an adult. And so I think so often with our parents, even though we're living with them day to day and we know them so intimately in some ways, I don't know, there were so many questions that I had never asked my mother. And once you start to really explore where your parents came from, I feel like it's less about forgiving them, but you can come to understand them. And just that understanding can lead to a lot of healing. I also think, I repeated a lot of the patterns of my childhood. I got into one horrible toxic relationship that I document in the book, and I had an eating disorder, and I had substance abuse issues myself. And so I think also when you can recognize the ways in which you're repeating dysfunctional behavior, that also leads to healing and forgiveness, because if you look at your parents' parents and you see how it's a long chain, and then it's your responsibility to not carry it out for another generation. But yeah, being honest with yourself about the ways that you're also like your parents. Yeah.
Yeah. I once heard Jeanette Walls, of course, the author of The Glass Castle, say in an interview, and this is not verbatim, but this is pretty close paraphrase. It's something like, "I believe that the worst experience in the world has a valuable gift in it if you're willing to receive the gift."
I couldn't agree more.
What do you think?
I couldn't agree more.
Right. I definitely wanted to ask you, are there writers who paved the way for you to be able to tell your story in this way, do you think?
Yeah. Jeanette Walls was a big one. I was studying painting in Italy, and my sister was in college at Barnard, where Jeanette had gone, and they had assigned The Glass Castle to her in a class. And Caitlin came to visit me in Italy where I was studying, and she had tucked the book into her suitcase. And as soon as she arrived, she got it out and she handed it to me like it was the secret we were going to share. And she said, "It's our life." And she just couldn't believe that someone had written a story and a true story. It wasn't masked as fiction, that dealt with some of the things we had dealt with, parents dealing with homelessness, substance abuse, that kind of thing. And I remember reading that book and just being so moved that she was so honest about what she'd been through, because, like Jeanette, my sister and I, at some point, growing up, we didn't realize that our family was not like other families until maybe adolescence, when it started to become very clear. And then we worked very hard to mask that. And so there was a time when Caitlin and I, my sister that I grew up with, we were the only two people that really shared the truth of our life. And then all of our friends, most people didn't know much about our home life or what we had been through. And that's such a lonely existence. And so I think, documenting the journey of coming from that place of shame to being truthful about your life, I think that was a huge influence on me, Jeanette, going through that. Because in many ways that was also my own journey.
On the topic of truth, in the author's note at the beginning of the book, you say that you rely on your own journals and your memory, as well as conversations with your mother and father and sister and others who factor into this story you're telling. Some other people get name changes or distinguishing characteristics changes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the methods, but mostly I wanted to ask, like, the methods you chose, did you think at all about, did you think of it as trying to tell the truest story you could, or the fullest version of the truth you could? Or was there some other constellation of qualities you were aiming for?
Well, of course it's my truth, but I tried my best to integrate the perspectives of the main characters. So,
okay.
I cross-checked, a lot of my father's and mother's stories. They lined up almost identically, but their emotional perspective on what had happened was different.
Right.
So I tried my best to put their point of view in, or when I disagreed with it, I just told what happened without getting too much into that. But I was trying to tell the story of both my parents and myself, more my mother than my father. There was a different draft of the book that got a little bit deeper into my dad, but it felt, it didn't feel right. It made the book too long, but yeah, of course, it's a book based on my truth and my memories, but I tried to lend the different perspectives of the main characters involved. And then with people who were secondary characters, I didn't think that anything was taken away from the book by changing their names. And I wasn't writing the book to, for example, if I was bullied in high school, I didn't feel the need to say the names of the girls that, there was no reason to do that. But my father had been very out in the open about his sperm donating. He was on the cover of the Times. And so there are parts of this story that are largely out in the world already. So it didn't,
But now it's about to be out in this form that you have determined as the writer, as the teller of the tale. So we're speaking just prior to publication, but I'm sure you've started to speak with other journalists about the book. Friends and family know, and a whole lot more readers are about to know. I kind of want to harken back to what you said about you and your sister with the glass castle. Like, this is our story too. Has the initial reaction to the book been what you anticipated? Are you hearing from early readers, this is my story too? Are you having people say, I'm just wondering if this is going to crack open much in the way that, you discovered this ever growing roster of siblings, the connections that storytelling forges between reader and author, like that you can see yourself in parts of a story. Has that started for you?
That's such a great question, and it has in such a beautiful way, I think. I've heard from, my publisher sent out books to random advanced, people who review advanced reader copies, and some of them have messaged me on Instagram and told me all kinds of stories about their lives, and that's so beautiful. That I do think that telling your truth tends to have the effect of making people feel more comfortable with their own. And that's been wonderful. You know, another surprise that has made me so happy is people saying, "Oh my God, I loved your mother. Can I talk to your mother? I want to speak to your mother." And, you know, the biggest, I think the thing preventing me from writing this book was that to tell the whole story of my mother, you know, she's a very complex woman, and there's a lot of light, but there's also dark, as, you know, every human being has in them. And I was a little protective over her, but also just felt this deep need to write the story. And so the fact that for the most part, people have loved my mother through the story, that also, that's been really meaningful to me. 'Cause I love her so much. And I hoped that love came through, even though, you know, she was a complex woman.
Oh yeah. And count me in the love crew.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
She's going to listen to this interview and hear you say it just like that, and have a little spring in her step.
I hope so. Would you ever option this memoir for development? Have you optioned it?
We've had some early talks, but we haven't. Nothing signed. So,
but in the concept of it, might you consider seeing it on screen one day?
I definitely would. I feel like you know, the role of my mother is catnip for some incredible actress.
Oh gosh! That's the perfect word for it too. Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't want to play Debra Olson? So, yeah, and you know, my mom and I worked through a lot of stuff to get her to the point where she was comfortable with me telling the story, and that in itself is a whole other story. So. I'm glad she's come full circle with it, and she's proud of me for writing it. That's also meant a lot to me.
I see that we're gliding towards the end of our time together today, and I just wanted to ask you, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about this beautiful book?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I think just, you know, I'm excited for you all to read it, and I think it's, you know, it's a wild story, and it's, you know, there are some heavier things, but it's also a story about my joyful and unusual childhood. And I think that it's one with a lot of larger themes that other people will relate to. I hope some bigger universal themes.
I truly believe they will. I did. Chrysta, thank you so much for joining me today on Fully Booked.
Thank you so much.